In this video, we're going to look at the most common measures and aggregation. We start with sum, we look at average, count rows, and also standard deviation. To look at the measures and aggregation, I will start with a simple sum. So I'm going to right-click Employee Performance, and I'm going to sum up the revenue. So I'm going to type total revenue, and I'm going to use a function called sum. Sum add all numbers. So I'm going to put the revenue in here, my fact sales revenue. I'm going to close my bracket and hit enter. Then right here you can see the measure that I just created here. The second measure I'm going to show you an example of is a transaction count. So in every table, each row in the table is usually a transaction. So if you look at the fact sales table, each row like this is a transaction that happened in store ID, trade date, this is the date it happened, the model sold, the LOB, the revenue generated, the unit sold, and the price. So to count the transaction of this table, I'm basically going to count the row. So I'm going to do new measure again. And I'm going to call this transaction count. I'm going to use a function called count rows. Count rows. I'm going to supply the table name, which is the fact sales. Once I close the bracket and I hit enter, that is my total transaction count using count. Another example is I want to do an average training score. So I want to know the average of this training score. So to do that, I'm going to right click again and do new measure. Average score. And I'm going to use average. Then I'm going to put average performance in here and close my bracket. Average training score. The last aggregation example I'm going to use is standard deviation. So I'm going to do new measure again. Now, standard deviation is one of the most interesting aggregates to check how data spread or move away from the mean. So basically, a lot of people use standard deviation to test if a data actually makes sense. So standard deviation is one of the most interesting aggregation methods you can use right there. And low standard deviation means that data are clustered around the mean, and high standard deviation indicate that data are more spread out. So I'm going to call this standard deviation for revenue, right? We want to know the revenue standard deviation. So to do that, there's a measure called stdev.p, stdev.p, stdev.p. So calculate standard deviation based on the entire population giving as argument, ignore logical value, and test. So I'm going to pick this measure and I'm going to supply revenue as a column. Standard deviation only asks for column. So I put in the revenue as a column and I hit enter. And I have successfully created my aggregation method. Now I can kind of probably use them in a visual. Let me put this in a card visual. This is my stand dev, and then I'm going to pick my total revenue also in a card visual. And I think this standard deviation is kind of very lower. What does that mean? That just means that data are clustered around the mean. So I'm also going to bring in the transaction count just to look at the total transaction count, and you see the total transaction count that I have. And I'm also going to bring in my average training score, and we're also going to look at the average training score. Average training score is 68.80. Now, all these measures that I created, these measure and aggregated measures, they are called anchor measures. And the reason why they are called anchor is because you can kind of reference them in another calculation. So say for example, I want to create another calculation again. I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I can reference this total revenue that I've already created. I can also reference my transaction count, I can reference the average score, and I can also reference the standard deviation.